Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum on this Sunday, July the 10th. And our topic's a tough one. Our topic is abortion. Okay, can we talk about it? As Christians. And so I'm a bit humble in leading this discussion because it's so complex. It's so nuanced. So what I mean by it being tough and nuanced, there's not one universal moral law that just touches all the myriad situations that are out there. This is a tough subject, and as you will hear, Christians have good arguments on all sides. Now, what makes this pressing and why we're raising it up on this Sunday is, of course, the Supreme Court's decision, which took away 50 years of a constitutional right that many had enjoyed, but of course, many others who fought and challenged. But interestingly, the Supreme Court gave no moral guidance in their decision. They really were neutral, as they said, about abortion. They really were just talking about the law. And so now that's going to push this decision into our communities, into our states. And so our interest as these conversations grow in our local communities, what do we as Christians then bring to this conversation? And as you know here at Emmanuel, the first thing we bring is civil discourse. We practice our 7 principles of civil discourse and spiritual discernment. It's a good time to memorize them: respect, listening, speaking for ourselves, understanding other viewpoints, gratitude, forgiveness, and the 8th commandment, which means putting the best construction on someone else's viewpoints. But we'll also want to talk and keep the focus on the moral, not just on the political. Others can care for that. I'm not putting down the political side of this debate, but we want to keep our focus on the moral discussion. And as Christians, well, can we use the Bible? Does the Bible inform this decision? Does theology inform this decision? Does church history give us any guidance at all in these decisions? Because our goal is to love our neighbors, okay? The neighbors with an S. We usually say to love our neighbors, our goal as Christians. But here the neighbor is both the woman, the mother, and the child. Both the unborn child and the child who's born. All right, so it's a difficult topic. And so we want to jump in with 5 different episodes. This will be a longer Sunday Forum because there's a lot of ground to cover. So the 5 areas will be, first of all, some legal frameworks, which has gotten us into this conversation. Some key statistics, so we're informed by what Pew and the New York Times and others are charting for us, what's happening out there. The third will be what are some Christian contributions, especially from the Bible and theology. Our own ELCA, and that's the 4th, has provided us with a study guide. It was written in 1991, but we'll want to review that quickly. And finally, I'll give some final thoughts because we want to bring all your insights and all your ideas to the Sunday Forum on this Sunday at 10:15. All right, are we ready to begin? Okay, let's jump in with our first section, which is on the legal frameworks. And why we're having this conversation, of course, was because of the Supreme Court's decision, taking away 50 years of legal rights. Now, what was interesting is they gave no moral judgment, as I mentioned before. It was about the law, and they felt that the Constitution should never have been used the way it was in Roe versus Wade. Now, one can argue both sides of this, but again, the Supreme Court gave no moral guidance, and our goal is to have a moral conversation. So now that's going to happen at a second level, which is in our legislative bodies in our states. And I'm a little nervous about this conversation in the states, to be quite honest, because it tends to suggest extremes, right? You'll have red and blue states all leaning to bumper sticker politics. It's either murder, abortion, some would even call it a child sacrifice. That's the kind of incendiary language which I don't think is helpful here. On the other hand, it's about privacy, my body, my choice, which does not see this within a larger community and its interests. And so I think the state legislative bodies, it's finally going to come down to this question. Who decides when it comes to abortion? Who decides? Is it the woman that we trust, or is it the state? Now, Roe v. Wade, they divided that question. They said, okay, in the first 2 trimesters, we'll trust the woman, basically, in conversation with her doctor and others in the community. But then in the 3rd trimester, we say the state has interest. And so Roe versus Wade divided that answer to the question. How do you answer it? Again, do we trust the woman, or do we trust the state, or both? All right, so that's the legislative. It's going to dominate the papers over the next months and years to come. Then there's the political framework, and I'm going to be honest with you here. Normally I try to stay as neutral as possible, but I don't trust politicians to guide us in moral deliberation, especially when it's a tough moral decision, because politicians, and I'm not trying to put them down here, I'm just trying to, well, maybe I am trying to put them down, I don't know, but they're often not the strongest in leading us through these nuances of political and moral decision making, because they have other interests. They're just trying to get elected, that's fine. They're trying to build a constituency, that's fine. But that's, I don't think, what we need here in helping us in providing guidance. I just point out that George Bush, Reagan, and Trump were all pro-choice before they were running for president. Then they were anti-abortion, and they were pro-life. Those were political decisions. Even Planned Parenthood, after Roe versus Wade was settled, was not sure that they wanted to offer abortions in their clinics. So the politics of this can be tricky, and I'm not always sure the politics are helpful to get us where we need to go, which is then the 4th framework. It's a moral issue. So let's keep our focus on a morality that leads to human thriving, where the women thrive, where a child unborn or born thrives. And so there we want to talk today about Scripture. How does Scripture inform that moral issue? What theology do we bring to bear? What processes, like our civil discourse, do we put so that we can have a Christian conversation, no matter which way that leans? Because finally it's about faith, and that we're encouraged to exercise our faith whether we go to the left or to the right. And of course, our goal is to love our neighbors, again with that S. And of course, we'll use biology and church history and other resources to help our faith guide our decision making. Okay, before we go any further, I think we have to look at some statistics, and I hope that these will be helpful. There's so many statistics in the New York Times, in the Pew Research, and Amnesty. There's just so many statistics out here, but here are some which I have found helpful. And the first is 1 out of 4 women get abortions. 1 out of 4. Now, let me add another statistic to that, just to put that into context, that 30 to 40% of all pregnancies end with miscarriages. So we're talking about an issue that most women have a relationship with, either themselves or people that they know, or their friends or their loved ones or their mothers, right? This is not a small issue. This is a big issue that women experience all the time. Secondly, the New York Times tries to give a picture of the typical woman who gets an abortion. Now, it's a little bit of it's dangerous, right? Because all sorts of women get abortions for all sorts of different reasons. That was our first point that we made. This is a tough decision because there's no one moral rule that fits all these situations, but it helps us to interpret some of the statistics. And so the New York Times says the typical woman having an abortion is already a mother, is in her late 20s, she's attended some college at some time, has a low income, is unmarried, and when she has that abortion, that is her first abortion. She lives in a blue state, and more often than not is a minority woman, because minority women usually have higher rates of unintended pregnancies. And so it's a conglomerate picture. It's helpful in one way because it helps us see the trends of the statistics, and yet all sorts of women get abortions for all sorts of different reasons. Third, abortions have been steadily going down since the 1970s. In fact, there's a decrease in abortions since the 70s. I think the height of abortions was in 1980. It's gone down 35% though since the 1970s, which is pretty dramatic. Although I have to say there's been an increase of 8% over the last 6 years, and I can't find out why. So I'll let somebody here do the research on why there's a tick up in abortions over the last few years. But the trend has been clear, it's gone down. And that's because, fourth, abortions are safe and they're getting safer. In 1960, there were 235 deaths which happened during these abortion techniques, these surgeries. In 2020, there were 2 deaths. And so it's often said that having an abortion is safer than childbirth. Fifth, 93% of all abortions happen when? In the first trimester. And that's important. Only 6% of abortions are in the second trimester, and 1% of abortions are in the third trimester. That's important because sometimes the posters we see would suggest otherwise. The brutal, gruesome pictures, that's usually in the third trimester, but 93% of all abortions are in the first trimester. And it's interesting here that half of women having an abortion are using some form of contraception. Now that struck me, I did not know that. But often the case is either the contraception doesn't work, the condom breaks, or the woman is not using the contraception in the way that is suggested, and therefore pregnancy occurs. 6, who's for it and who's against it as Americans? Where do we lean on this? Well, 61 to 70%, depending on the company that did the surveys, feel positively. They say abortion should be legal all or most of the time, 61 to 70%. And then who's against? 30 to 37% say that abortion should be illegal most or all the time. So 2 to 1 Americans feel abortions should be accessible either all the time or most of the time. Okay, those are statistics. I think it helps frame the conversation, but what I've realized is often we don't look at the statistics really, we look at our own lives, and we all have stories. And so here I want to show you a picture of my mom and dad, and I show it because my father really was anti-abortion. He was very outspoken. In fact, he had pride that he could vote for Democrats and Republicans. He'd say that. And he was proud of that because his grandfather, my grandfather, felt the same way. He thought, I'll choose the best candidate. But my father had one caveat: I'll elect a Democrat, but only if they're not pro-choice. For him, this was just a very personal matter, and it was really what determined often his vote. And it was only 2 years before his death that he shared with me why he felt so strongly. And it was a personal story. Again, it wasn't the Bible passage, it wasn't theology. It was because his mother had lost a child who was aborted 5 years before my father was born. And she had some complications. The doctor thought she might die, and so they aborted the child. 5 years later, the same thing happens again to my grandmother, his mother. Same issues, same challenges, but now medicine had come a long way, and the doctor said, I think I can solve this problem and save the baby, and that's what happened, and that was my father. And so it kind of haunts him that if he had been conceived 5 years before, he might not have been born altogether. And so for him, that was a a critical moment which helped him in his own moral reflections. Now, I'm guessing you have experiences too. I mean, the statistics suggest it. So we want to take a moment, we want to take a break. This is a longer presentation. And so I've got my coffee, and I'm going to encourage you to get some coffee as well, to pause this conversation, to think about your own stories, maybe your own experience with abortion, or maybe you have a daughter or your mother who's had experiences one way or the other, positive or negative. We want to be aware of the stories. And as you're drinking your coffee and thinking about those stories, maybe just jot it down or get it in your mind. We want to bring those stories to the Sunday Forum this Sunday at 10:15, because again, often the stories are what are guiding us in our moral decisions. So enjoy a cup of coffee. We'll see you back here in a second.
Let's go out to the kitchen. Let's go out to the kitchen. Let's go out to the kitchen and have ourselves a snack.
Okay, welcome back. I'm going to put my coffee down now. And we want to continue, but we want to remember those stories because they're so important. All right, we've gone over some of the legal frameworks and some of the statistics. What do Christians then bring to this conversation? And the first I want to suggest is discernment, not shouting matches. This happens in communities, and it's very important that when a woman has to make certain tough decisions, and this I think is for any tough moral decision, we don't want to do it alone. We don't want to do it in isolation. We don't want to be sitting alone in our room, because that will never produce good results. We want to be surrounded by people who love us, who can help us discern, and as Christians we'd say, act in faith in making decisions. You know, the Jewish community talks about a minyan being 10 that's necessary, to having this community that surrounds you. Jesus changed that a bit and said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them. And so I think that's a good rule to say, can we surround a woman who's making tough decisions with 2 or 3 friends, family, those who can support her in that decision making. That helps a woman and gives her guidance. Platitudes aren't going to help here. We need to give concrete decisions. Secondly, demand a moral conversation. It's not a political one. It's a moral that emphasizes human flourishing. Because that's why God gave us the laws, is so that we would flourish as women, as mothers, as children, as families. And this is going to force all our politicians, by the way, to invest more into resources that surround women. Because you can't ask a moral question that leads to flourishing without providing adequate education and health care and all the necessary educational needs for preschool and the things that surround a woman and a family that give her confidence to make a moral decision where it's not about life and death matters or issues of poverty. And so whatever position you have, pro-life or pro-choice, human thriving is going to demand that whatever our states decide, more resources have to be given and surrounding women. All right, third, we want to bring the Bible into the conversation, okay? And I want you just to buckle up for this, because I read one prominent Bible preacher who said the Bible doesn't speak to the issue of abortion, and I think it does, and completely gives us resources. And the first, I would say, is Genesis. We go back to that creation account, and there's 2 issues here I want you to pay attention to. And the first is, the issue in creation is not about life, it's about human life. When God forms the animals, he creates life. But God doesn't breathe into their nostrils the breath of life, this divine spark, which we would call the soul, the thing that makes us the image of God. That's God breathing in to Adam and making that lump of clay into something just lower than God in God's self. And so the first thing is we have an image because God has breathed into us. And so often, especially the Jewish community, the human soul comes in when you take the first breath. You're not really a human being until the baby is born. You slap his butt or whatever you do now with modern techniques, and that child just takes a breath and becomes a human soul. Now, the second part is when God says to Adam and Eve, I'm giving you dominion over all things. And I've wondered about what that dominion means in reference to life and death issues, especially with children, or having contraception, controlling the amount of children we have and the type of families that we have. I believe we've been given dominion. The question is, before God, how do we use that dominion in ways that promote human flourishing? But we also have the Ten Commandments, right? And often it's just, thou shalt not kill, which is quoted, probably more accurately, thou shalt not murder. But what's important about that is not just that we don't, the negative side, don't murder, but also what Luther says in his explanation to the creed, or to the commandment, where he says, it's not just that we don't murder, there's a positive side, that we take care of the neighbor in all their bodily and physical needs. So again, I think rightly understanding the Ten Commandments says don't kill, but also provide the framework and support for a mother and child, again, unborn and born. Secondly, though, in Exodus 21, we do have laws that Moses gives, which distinguishes a woman's life from the life of the fetus or the embryo. And so if someone attacks a woman, if she lives, but the embryo dies or the fetus, they only have to negotiate compensation for the loss of the child, loss of the unborn child. But if she dies in that attack, the attacker is put to death. And so the Jewish law distinguishes legally, it says both are important, both are valued, but they're valued differently. The fetus and the life of the woman. And in Numbers 5, we have an abortion pill. Okay, I couldn't believe this when I read this story of Numbers 5. It's about the story's about a jealous man who thinks his wife has been unfaithful. He goes to the priest in the temple, complains about his wife, and the priest puts together this abortion pill that he takes, which is like this bitter water. It's probably got some herbs in it, and it's got some of the dirt from the ground of the temple, and it gives it to the woman, and it says in the text, it's meant to drop her uterus. It's meant so that she will have a miscarriage, so to speak, that the man doesn't have to take responsibility for caring for the progeny of some other man. And what makes this text weirder, any jealous man can do the same thing, even if he hasn't suspected his wife of being unfaithful. All right, there's more there that I want to discuss in this, but here you've got actually the priest giving the abortion pill with a curse, with a prayer, saying, God, this is what we're hoping for here, so this man doesn't have to carry the responsibility for a child that is not his own. So the Bible does speak to these issues, and so does church history. And here's a shout out to my daughter. When I was presenting her some of these matters and giving her opinion and feedback, she said, well, Dad, you got to share something about church history. Church history really is important here. And I went, I don't know if we have time for all this. She said, you have to. So, okay, I'm doing this for my daughter, but it's also really interesting. Remember, abortions go back to the children of Israel in Egypt with Pharaoh. Again, his interest was not human flourishing, but rather to control the number of slaves because he was afraid they would take power over the Egyptians. And so he asked then these Hebrew midwives to abort all male fetuses. Now, they disobeyed that order, but their abortion was basically a state technique to control the slave population. And this often happens in states when they gain the control. They use it for state purposes rather than for human flourishing. We see that in China with the one-child policy. But we also saw that in Rome and Greek. Rome and Greece both promoted abortions sometimes and were against them other times. But mostly in the pagan world, it was amoral. You could do it if you wanted to. We have Aristotle, who was pro-abortion because he was worried about overpopulation. And at the time of Jesus, we have Augustus Caesar, who was anti-abortion because he wanted more Roman citizens to be born, and he accused the Romans of lacking all morals for not having more children. By and large, though, the pagan world was willing not only to have abortions, but to practice infanticide. And there's where the church came in to defend. They said, well, your gods promote that. Your gods even eat their own young, where the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was the creator of the world and values the creation, made us in the image of God. And so in the early church, they were very much opposed to abortion. In the Didache, one of the most famous texts, it says, "Thou shalt not murder a child by abortion, nor kill him when born." That's in Didache 2, verse 2. Pretty clear. Now that changes in the medieval church and after the Reformation. And so here you have Christians bringing in other resources, bringing in other Bible texts, and bringing in other theologies. But one of the key questions was, when does a human being become a human being? Now, what do you think? Actually, there are 3 answers. You wish it was simple, but it's 3 answers. And the one you hear, especially promoted by the Roman Catholic Church, is life begins at conception. Right? Right when the sperm and the egg connect and start sharing DNA, that is when human life begins. So that's one answer. The second really comes also from church history, from Thomas Aquinas, who went all the way back to Aristotle. And he felt really what made a human is when the human has a soul. And Thomas Aquinas felt that there was a later ensoulment, often called quickening. And so you've maybe heard that phrase, that all of a sudden the baby starts moving in the womb and the woman starts getting excited because now it's acting like a baby inside of her. It reacts to even song and music and the human voice. They say, that's when the soul enters that fetus. But then we just read Genesis, where it was that first breath of life. And that's when the child becomes independent of the mother, takes that first breath, and then receives the human soul. Is there any consensus? Is it conception? Is it the late ensoulment in the second, third trimester? Or is it the breath of life when the child leaves the womb? Is there an answer, a right answer? No. I wish there was consensus, but there's not. And so we try to come up with biological answers. We try a little bit of theology like natural law. Natural law says, first of all, that humans are built with a certain moral instinct in our gut, in our hearts. And we understand this, right? If you're on a boat and the boat's starting to sink, somebody gets up and says what? Save the women and children, right? We have that instinct that the future of life is wrapped up with women and children. That's that instinct of natural law, and it is pro-life. So in this regard, we're all pro-life. We're all trying to guard, especially women in particular, because they're such a source of life, and that's in our instinct. But others would add, we're also self-preservation is part of natural law. And we realize this when, for example, we're attacked, we defend ourselves, even to the point of war. And some would say, is war evil? We say, yes, war is evil. But sometimes we conduct the evilness of war to preserve ourselves, to defend our quality of life, to defend ourselves when we're under attack. And so we do evil things because that's also part of our gut instincts. You might say part of the moral law. Finally, vocation. Who's called to make the decision? And I mean that in a theological sense. When God creates, God gives instructions. He gives a call to have dominion. And so this idea of dominion forces us to say, who has been given the call, so to speak, to make these weighty decisions? Once again, just a reminder, is it the woman, the wider community, or the state? Oh, I don't know about you, but I could take another cup of coffee. That was just a lot of information. And I want you again to get that second cup of coffee and just think about what you've heard. It's a lot of information. And you want to just review it in your head, because then in a moment we want to put our coffee cups down and we want to say, okay, are there any final thoughts that would help us in our discussion? Because we want to bring all these ideas, these insights, remember our personal stories, and now our reactions to all this other information to inform our moral judgments as communities and individuals. We want to bring that all to the Sunday Forum again at 10:15 and share that with one another. So, enjoy your second cup of coffee.
Let's go out to the kitchen. Let's go out to the kitchen. Let's go out to the kitchen and have ourselves a snack.
All right, before we end our session, put down your cup of coffee. I do want to say that the ELCA has a statement, and if you would like, we'd like to point to that. Just really briefly, to summarize, it was written in 1991, so it's an older statement. But basically, the ELCA summarizes abortion should be regulated, accessible, and rare. Regulated in the sense that it's not just the woman's decision, it takes part within a larger community and the state. So it should be regulated, but it should be accessible, because we know women, it says, will get abortions. And so the question is not abortion or not abortion, but safe abortion. So it should be accessible, but it should be rare. And here the ELCA challenges state legislators and communities to put more and more resources around a woman and the whole experience of pregnancy and early childhood rearing, so that it lessens the moral pressure on women to get abortion. It creates a more conducive, loving environment where these moral decisions could be made. And as the statement says, that abortion is a decision of last resort. Now that's 1991. It was a guiding statement. It has no authority in our church. It's just to help conversations in the congregations. All right, so where are we? Any final thoughts that we want to share? And there are a few to close our session. First of all, and this is just to remind us, this whole abortion issue is nuanced and complex. There are 1,000 reasons women get abortions, not one or two. And there is no one regulation or law that helps address all those issues. So we don't want political platitudes. We don't want bumper sticker politics to drive deep moral issues that affect just every woman, almost every woman. So first of all, it's nuanced. Hear the stories of real women and real children, and keep the focus on the moral issues, not the political ones first. Remember, what is legal is not necessarily what is moral, and what is moral should not necessarily be enacted into law. Second, abortion, whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, should be rare. There's no one arguing to be pro-abortion. If it's pro-choice or pro-life, you want abortions to be rare, and you therefore have to create the conditions so that they will be rare, that we're supporting women with many, many, many more resources to make that a decision of last resort. And I have to say this as a man. Sometimes it's really frustrating to hear men discuss these issues, and we don't know what we're talking about because we haven't experienced it ourselves. So we have to listen to women who do understand these processes because they've experienced them, and sometimes multiple times personally. I'm not saying that men have no say in this, but we have to listen, both on all sides of the decision, to women who just have more experience and more knowledge of these issues. We got to be pro-family, pro-children, pro-mother, pro-woman, and all these things. It's very important. And finally, it's a vocational question. I find this fascinating because here at Emmanuel, we've talked about vocation, that calling, because when God creates, God calls. And so we come back again to the issues of privacy or state interest. Who is being called to make these decisions? Again, do we call women to make these difficult moral decisions, or are we trusting and calling the state to make these tough moral decisions? So what's the vocational dimension to this, and what are the limitations? What are the limitations we're going to give on women and the state? Because I would argue both are involved in this decision making, but we have to be sensitive to both what the call is and what are the limitations of the call. All right, so thanks for having the patience to go all the way through this presentation on abortion. I hope you found it helpful, maybe in giving different language and different resources to your own decision, but also just helping understand someone else, what's behind someone else's decision. However we approach these moral questions, here's my final statement. No freedoms, no laws, no policies or regulations should cause, in the end, more problems than they solve. So whatever we do and whatever we feel called to do, we want to keep our focus on women, on mothers, on children, the born and the unborn, families and communities, because we want them to thrive. Thanks for joining us for the Sunday Forum. Bye-bye now.